Welcome, everybody. Oh, we see. Everyone's popping in. I think most people can hear me. We invite you to turn on your gallery view so you can see everybody, see everyone's faces. It's so important in these times to see faces, to see the faces of the fellow pilgrims who are joining us today. And we are honored and thankful that you're here. I'm Deborah Tomlinson with Inside the Vatican Pilgrimages, and I'm joined today by Father Tony Figueiredo, who is usually in Assisi, but now he's back in London visiting his mother, and he'll be going back to Assisi in a few days, and with Dr. Robert Moynihan, the founder and editor of Inside the Vatican magazine. We're excited for today's pilgrimage. And it's a very special one that Father Tony has been working on to prepare. So we're very grateful for that. And we're honored to have him with us today. Father Tony, how are you today in London?
I'm doing absolutely great. It's raining in London for a change, but we're doing fine, actually. Yeah, it's good to be back with my mother. Thank you, Deb. And today, Bob, you were saying is your mother's birthday. She went to the Lord 2 years ago, so we remember Ruth, your mother too, on this day.
Thank you, Father.
Yes. So, well, I think we should begin. We welcome everybody, and now we will begin. I'm going to share my screen now.
Thanks, Deb. Today is also the memorial of St. John Eudes, or Eudes, who lived in the 1600s. Great French saint who really promoted devotion to the Sacred Heart of Jesus and the Immaculate Heart of Mary. An interesting fact about St. John Eudes is that he faced two huge plagues in his time, in 1627 and 1631. But he was so intent on continuing ministry in his diocese that what he did was to set up home in a huge cask in the field. So literally he lived like a big wine cask or something like that, in the middle of a field, so that he wouldn't infect his religious brothers. And that enabled him to continue his ministry, especially to those who were sick and dying from the plague. So I think there's a lesson to be learned then. He went on to be a great saint, to found two religious orders. Interestingly enough, as well, he founded, it was a great time of economic crisis in France at the time, and no one knew what to do with the prostitutes. There's a similar argument going on actually in these days with Pope Francis, interestingly enough. And what St. John Eudes did was to found a new religious congregation, specifically to look after the prostitutes, the Sisters of the Refuge. And so in his time, he founded two religious orders. Well, welcome everyone. It's wonderful to be with you this afternoon, and I'm very happy to speak today about two great saints, Francis and Clare. I really believe that God uses three characteristics, our humanity, really based in our humanity, to draw us to holiness. I think that's really important. God uses our humanity to draw us to holiness. And in that, he draws on our past, our future, and our present. That's all we know in our humanity, our past, our future, and our present. In other words, then, there is never a moment in our lives when God is not present. St. John of the Cross puts it this way: the language of God is the experience that he writes inside our life. So in other words, God is speaking to us through concrete events in our life, just as he's speaking to us today in the current situation we are living. What I'd like to do this afternoon is to look at the two great saints of Assisi in terms of their past, their future, and their present, by reflecting on three aspects that all begin with the letter C. Conversion in the past, you see it on the screen there. Confidence with which one faces the future, and charity, by which one lives in the present. I think this can really help us. How did these three characteristics, conversion, confidence, and charity, turn Francis into Saint Francis and Clare into Saint Clare? Let's begin with conversion, reviewing the past. Francis and Clare had very different youths with very different upbringings, but both underwent a conversion experience, which we too underwent and in many ways undergo every day, whether or not we call it by that name. Conversion, in the Greek metanoia, means literally that we are walking in a certain direction, then we stop to take heed of where our lives are heading. Always God is the first mover, so it's his grace that moves us to that. And when we discern that we need to change direction, we turn around again with the help of God's grace. We know already much about the life of Francesco Bernardone, St. Francis. As you see in this image, this sums up much of his life, this bronze statue in front of the main basilica in Assisi, which is still there today. Francis the romantic, the dreamer, who loved parties. He was known as the king of the feasts, who led a free, easygoing life, spoiled as he was by his wealthy parents. Francis was the natural heir to his father's successful cloth business. In the testament that he compiled in the last months of his life, Francis himself paints his first 25 years, and I quote, as living in sin, which he describes as organizing everything around himself, pursuing vain hopes of earthly glory. Clare was quite different. In her youth, you see an image here of Clare, as already she's entered the religious life here, but you can imagine how beautiful she is. In this picture, we see something of that. She was, in fact, stunningly beautiful. From a noble, aristocratic family, she dressed as nobles did. I think you can see something of that here again in that image, bedecked with jewels and the finest of pearls. Her wealthy father had plans of a great wedding for her, and there was no shortage of prospective noble husbands. But Clare, enlightened surely also by her deeply religious upbringing, especially bestowed upon her by her mother, insisted that she wished to remain chaste, a virgin for the Lord. So just a point for us, I always like to bring this in, each of us falls into one of these two categories, and so do the people around us. Perhaps we have children, grandchildren, people we know, whose lives are very much away from the Lord. I hope we can take hope in these two saints. Our past lives perhaps have been very chaste, have been very pure, a real gift, but can bring its own challenges in time. Or perhaps we've led a very sullied life, with sins, great or small, which also brings enormous challenges. Are you a Francis or a Clare? At some point, both Francis and Clare, reading the experience that God was writing in their lives, stopped. They reflected. For Francis, just as with two other founders of great religious orders, we've already looked at St. Ignatius of Loyola. Next week, we'll look at St. Augustine. Francis found himself increasingly unsatisfied. He had everything going for him: wealth, health, friends, girls, yet he was not happy. As for Clare, she looked at her life, the choice between nobility and Jesus. And Clare realized that her life could only be fulfilled by giving it completely to Jesus, the spouse she had grown in love with. And so, as he does for us, God used events to lead Francis and Clare to him. For Clare, it was the witness, the preaching of Francis, as well as the opposition that she faced from her family. It's interesting because Clare lived right next door to the great cathedral of San Rufino, and she would hear Francis preach in that cathedral, and it really helped her. For a whole year she planned with Francis on where her life was heading. For Francis, as you see in this image, it was the cross that appeared in his life. Not only this cross of Saint Damiano that spoke to him, but the actual cross in his life. Each one of us has some cross in our life that we face, and it can be a real defining moment for us. At the age of about 20, Francis, that budding knight, as you saw on that horse in front of the basilica, he was the first to enlist in the army, the first to encourage his friends to do the same, but it all ended shamelessly, as a failure. He was taken prisoner and locked away in the grim dungeons of Perugia for a whole year, where he was treated with brutality. Maybe some of you are listening a little bit to the experience of Cardinal Pell in prison and how it's really affected his life as well. Not in a bad way, not in a bad way. And that's the point. God is able to draw good out of evil. And the interminable days spent in the darkness of the prison seems to have lighted some kind of light in the soul of Francis. He had time to reflect on his past life, the fragility of the human condition. A harsh existence in the prison took its toll on him. He fell ill. And when he finally returned home, this illness also kept him away from his former lifestyle. Interesting, even in this time of pandemic, imagine how many are being kept from a serious life of sin. Locked up in his own home, often bedridden, Francis began to see himself and his life with entirely new eyes. There was also obviously that experience with the leper, meeting the leper, that changed him. What is the point of life? What am I living for? For both Francis and Clare, struggles, difficulties, touched by the love of Christ who looked at them, drew them out of the crowd, led to profound compassion for the human condition. Just look at this cross. Archbishop Sorrentino gave a beautiful reflection on this cross. But if you see, the eyes of Jesus are wide open. And in a real sense, Jesus is drawing us into the cross. Just reflect on that for a moment. Look at the cross. And Jesus is saying, enter the cross, enter your cross, my cross. You will suffer, but with faith, it will lead to a better life for you, a more fulfilled life. And that's exactly what happened with Francis. Profound compassion for the human condition, patience, mercy, offering one's own sufferings, penance for the other. There's a beautiful story about this, one of my favorites in the Little Flowers of St. Francis. Francis is talking to one of his brothers, Brother Leo. There's an image of Francis and Brother Leo. You can imagine them walking through the fields one day. You have that image there coming up of Francis and Brother Leo. There they are. And literally they're talking as they're walking. And Francis says to Leo, as you see in this image, "You're very pensive, Leo." And Leo responds by saying, "If only I had some purity within me." And Francis says, what is purity then? What is this purity of heart? And Leo responds without hesitation, "It is to have no fault with which to reproach oneself." "Then I understand your sadness," Francis responds, "because one always has something to regret." Francis goes on, "Turn your gaze toward God. Marvel over God. Be grateful to God because He is Lord." That, little brother, is the meaning of a pure heart. And Leo comes back and says, "But doesn't God demand our efforts, our faithfulness?" "Without a doubt," answers Francis. "But holiness is not developing oneself to the utmost, nor is it an achievement of one's own doing." "How is holiness achieved then?" asks Leo. And listen carefully how Francis responds. "We must make room for God. We must accept our poverty, to renounce all that weighs us down, even the weight of our own faults. We must see nothing but the glory of God and bask in it. God is. God suffices. One's desire for perfection has changed into a simple and pure love for God." conversion in the past, leading to that compassion, especially for the weak, in the present. Let's turn to the second point, then, that second C, confidence in the future. Confidence in the future. There you have another beautiful image of Francis and Brother Leo. Real recommendation if you're looking for something to read, The Little Flowers of St. Francis. They're really beautiful little stories of his life, really, that have been written down. Let's look at that second point then, confidence in the future. All of us have our favorite lines in sacred scripture. I think I've given this one before, as you see on your screens, as one of my favorite lines from the book of Proverbs. Where there is no vision, the people perish. A vision or a goal given by God, which even in the face of difficulties, struggles, persecutions, we go ahead, growing in fortitude, growing in holiness. Now, I celebrated my first Mass on the altar of St. Francis Cabrini in New York City. Her body lies there, and this nun was absolutely amazing. She was tiny in stature. She was tiny. That gives me a lot of consolation. And as a young girl, she fell into a pool of water back in Italy, which made her terrified of water. But just then imagine that when she announced to Pope Leo XIII her desire to go to the missions in China, because she could go overland to China, what did the Pope say to her? Not to the east, but to the west. What did that mean? Crossing the Atlantic. Water. And that little nun, who was terrified of water, obeyed. In fact, in her lifetime, she made 24 trips across the Atlantic by ship, each one taking 12 days, often in terrible conditions. And if you just imagine all the obstacles she faced, when she arrived in New York City, assured that the Archbishop would welcome her after a winter journey, you know what he said to her, the first thing? What are you doing here? I told you not to come at this time. The letter had not reached her. Beautiful welcome, eh? The Archbishop of New York. Perseverance based on confidence in God's call. Where there is no vision, the people perish. How true for Francis and Clare. Clare had that vision to follow in the footsteps of Francis, and nothing could stop her. It's just an amazing story. You know, she had planned on following Francis for a whole year. And then on Palm Sunday night, I mean, there's huge crowds outside San Rufino. I was there last week with Archbishop Sorrentino. I'm not sure if he's on with us today. I know he'd like to be. He sends you his blessings. He's very busy at this time. But there are huge crowds outside San Rufino. And you know what she does? She escapes through the back door of her house to go down to Santa Maria degli Angeli. This is the picture, actually. I think I took this, Deb. Is that correct?
That's
I took
correct.
a photo just last week. And this is the front door of her house. And you can actually see on the stone outside the house in Italian, this is the place where Saint Clare was born and passed and spent the first years of her youth. And so it is that on that Palm Sunday night, she goes down to the Porzincula in Santa Maria degli Angeli. She's accompanied by friars who meet her with lanterns. It's beautiful scriptural passage, remember? The bride coming down, and who does she meet there? She meets Francis, and he begins to cut the beautiful blonde locks of her hair. And then, after spending some time in a little town called Bastia, and then a little bit of time in another place on Mount Subiasso, she enters San Damiano, the convent there, and she never leaves there. It's absolutely incredible. She only comes out of San Damiano, the convent there, one time to meet Francis. One time. And for half her life, she suffered from a mysterious illness that deprived her of physical strength, that would finally leave her bedridden, almost blind, becoming an invalid. Perseverance is the point I'm making. Without a vision, the people perish. But Clare had that vision, and nothing would stop her. Holiness through the struggle. Francis the same. Francis received his mission, we know this well, in that completely dilapidated church of San Damiano, in front of the crucifix. He heard the voice of Jesus telling him, Francis, can you not see that my church is falling into ruins? Go, rebuild my house. So it is that from that crucifix, speaking to Francis, I think you have an image, Deb, of that crucifix, speaking to Francis, as you see there, that dilapidated church. Francis would then begin his mission. He had confidence that God had given him an enormous mission and nothing would stop him. It went as far as leaving his homeland, joining the papal crusades, to the religious lights in the Holy Land, meeting there with the Sultan, the ruler of Egypt, Syria, Palestine, that same Sultan who had ordered that a gold piece should be given for the head of every Christian who was slain. Yes, Francis went to him. But perhaps the greatest sufferings for Francis, again I repeat, holiness through the struggle, through the difficulties, came from within the order that he had founded. We find this very often with the founders of great religious orders. Upon returning from the Crusades, Francis found brothers who wanted to go their own ways. They wanted learning. So others wanted greater comfort rather than absolute poverty. Even in his later years, he died, as we know, when he was just 44. It led to a certain depression, a dark night in Francis. It's like Mother Teresa in many ways, exacerbated by physical problems. By the end of his life, Francis was half blind. How did he and Clare persevere in the call entrusted to them? How did they hold on to that vision? First of all, through prayer. At a time when he wanted to give everything up, and maybe you've experienced that in your marriage or your priesthood or whatever God has called you to in your life, Francis at that very moment writes in his testament what he heard the Lord saying to him. And these words I repeat to you. Why are you sad? Is not your order my order? Am I not its chief shepherd? Stop troubling yourself and look rather to your own salvation. Is not your order my order? Am I not its chief shepherd? Is that a word that consoles you today? In front of the difficulties, the challenges you and I are facing? Let's move on to that third point, charity. charity in the present. So we've looked at the past, that conversion. We've looked at the future, that confidence, facing it with that humble confidence in the Lord's call. And now let's look at charity. Interestingly enough, in Assisi, Archbishop Sorrentino is just writing his pastoral plan for the next 3 years, and it will all be based on charity. Christian charity is really what is key. Charity in the present. Saints follow Jesus in loving extravagantly, I would say. But that love for Clare and Francis was different. Remember that Clare's love was spent entirely within the walls of a convent, filled with penance, prayer, fasting, mortifications that today seem extreme to us, a coarse and rough habit, a hair shirt, a wooden block for her pillow. Imagine, this was the noble woman who once wore fine pearls. So her charity was all lived within the convent walls. I hope that gives many of us really encouragement. I know many of you through this lockdown are living as if in a convent, unable to go out, especially the elderly, the sick. I think of my own mother. That is charity lived well. And our sufferings are never wasted when we offer them to someone else, offer them up for someone else. You have an enormous mission within the walls of your own homes or wherever God places you. But then think of Francis, his charity was a life spent ad exterior, the itinerant preacher in missions in and beyond Italy, seeking to reconcile warring nations, warring factions. He was a man of peace, a life of charity, complete self-giving, as seen in his encounter with the leper. And it's interesting because Clare and Francis were living at a time for the church which in many ways was similar to our own: deep corruption and clerical infidelity within the church, heresies, constant warfare between Christians and Muslims. But what was the medicine used against all of these challenges? Self-giving love for the other. People are converted by love, not by rejection or fear or anger. 3 legs in particular were important for them: love of the Eucharist, love of the Blessed Mother, and love of poverty and simplicity. And I want to finish with each one of them. Love of the Eucharist. When you see images of Saint Clare, you will see her depicted with a monstrance, as you see here, bearing the Eucharist. St. John Paul II described Clare, and I quote, as a Eucharist. Imagine how beautiful. Because from behind enclosure, she raised up a continual thanksgiving to God, accepting and offering all to God in union with Jesus. Francis also had a passionate devotion to the Blessed Sacrament. It was the heart of his life, the Mass. So much did he revere the Eucharist that he considered himself unworthy to be ordained as a priest. But how did Jesus enter this world? And this is this second point of the Eucharist, the Blessed Virgin Mary. Jesus entered this world in the flesh of the Blessed Virgin Mary. Really strong in Francis, the humanity. And the Blessed Virgin Mary offers her virginal body to God through the power of the Holy Spirit, who enabled, in the words of Clare, and I quote what Clare says about the Blessed Virgin Mary, she carried Jesus in the tiny enclosure of her sacred womb. Today we may wonder, why is it that people spend an entire life given up for chastity, virginity? Well, if you are convinced that you carry Jesus in your body, why would you want anyone or anything else? This quote of Francis, perhaps one of my most beautiful. Behold, daily he humbles himself, as when from his royal throne he came into the womb of the Virgin. Daily he himself comes to us with like humility. Daily he descends from the bosom of his Father upon the altar in the hands of the priest. O sublime humility, O humble sublimity, that the Lord of the universe, God and Son of God, so humiliates himself as to hide himself for our salvation under the little appearance of bread. Look, brother, at the humility of God, and open your hearts before him. Francis and Clare, as you see here. What is the secret of the saints? What was the secret of Francis and Clare? Something very attractive. They were lovers. Lovers of God and lovers of the human person. This did not make their religion a theory, but a love affair. I'm writing a little booklet at the moment about this young saint, Carlo Acutis, who died at just the age of 15 in 2006. Imagine, I'm talking with his mother in these days in Assisi. It's amazing talking with the mother of Blessed. It doesn't happen very often. And it's just incredible, because his life too was a love affair, a romance, a love affair with God. We believe in Jesus Christ, not as an idea, but the person of Jesus. And from this daily love affair with Jesus comes a self-giving for our brothers and sisters, a love for God and a love for neighbor that nothing, no one can take away. Just to finish here with, I hope this is from a very famous photographer, this photo.
And who might that be?
His name is Anthony Figueiredo. And I took this photo last week, actually. I went to the cemetery in Assisi. I think it was last Friday. And as I was walking back, peering through the trees, was the great basilica of St. Francis. And so this is a live photo, if you like, of beauty. St. Francis and St. Clare, pray for us.